All right, welcome back, guys. So in this video, I want to talk about the similarities between the way flat earthers think and the way atheists think. Now, in my previous videos, so if you've been watching the videos on my channel, you already know, I have never thought that atheist beliefs and arguments ever made any sense since I was a kid, right? Until this day, I still have never heard of a rational atheist argument. And there's this weird, there's this weird sort of reputation that atheists have kind of tried to give themselves by labeling themselves certain things, that atheists are more scientific. They say they're more rational and logical and more science-oriented. Well, first of all, I'm science-oriented. I've been that way since I've been a kid, right? Atheists are not more rational, they're not more logical, and they're definitely, especially not more scientific. I don't know where that sort of reputation has come from. That's always confused me, right? I understand them claiming themselves to be more rational, more logical, which is not true. But, on which I'm going to talk about flat earthers also think they're rational and logical. But scientific, atheists definitely, especially aren't more scientific. I'm actually going to talk about that probably in the next video. I'm going to go a little more into that. But that's been a very strange kind of, reputation that I think it's just part of propaganda, atheist and materialist propaganda, because there's a lot of that in society, which I'll probably make videos about that too. But anyway, getting back to it, basically I just want to establish in this video, and I'll probably make a part 2 to the video because I want to go more into flat earth arguments and then compare them to atheist arguments and show how they're very similar and how they don't follow proper science. But I just thought about that when I started recording this video, but I'm like, you know what? Because I don't have everything set up, I'll do it in another video. But, so what I want to get into this video is basically just to say how atheists are very similar to flat earthers. Now, basically the main way I want to say that they're similar in this video is when it comes to evidence, right? So an atheist will always say there's no, oh my God, yeah, you know how many, I used to talk to so many atheists on Reddit, right? So mainly it was Reddit. I would talk to them. I've probably talked to over 100 atheists, had arguments with them. They always say the same thing over and over and over and over again. I've never heard of a new argument from an atheist. It's always the same thing and in the same order, right? And I did it in the comments for some of my videos, and it's the exact same things I dealt with from Reddit. It's always the same arguments. But when atheists, they always will kind of begin the debate or begin their arguments or their explanation for their ideas or why they're atheists with the idea that there's no evidence of God. And to me, I always forget to mention this. So if you're new to the channel, my name is Chuck. I wrote a theory on metaphysics. So it's not like I don't have a well-structured theory on how the spirit realm works. I do. I literally made one and I wrote the book on it, right? So if you're interested in learning it, I developed a website, subconsciousenginemechanics.com, links in the description. It's about a roughly 2-semester course, so if you're interested in that, you can take a look. Right now, so when atheists when they say there's no evidence of God, to me, I know how the spirit realm works, and there's plenty of evidence of God all over the place. It makes no sense to say that there's no evidence of God. What are you talking about? I can easily point out evidence of God, and I usually do when I'm talking to them. So, for example, what would be an example of evidence of God? First of all, for me, when I was I forget which age, when I first even thought of the idea of when I first learned atheists existed, or I probably was 9 years old or something, and they would make the argument, oh, there's no God. You can even make a rationalist argument, which is purely a logic-based argument that isn't necessarily investigative of reality. You didn't actually do anything to investigate how reality works, which you can't make a rational argument for how reality works. You always have to engage with reality. That's how science works. But you can get about 99% of the way there simply with a rationalist argument, this would be, I believe, is called cosmological argument or first cause argument, right? Which is just the idea that we exist, right? The only way to explain that and to get around the paradox of a first cause, to get around the paradox of organization, which is basically, I think it's called intelligent design or teleological argument. The only way to get around these ideas, the paradox of energy, is by having a supernatural, right? So someone who is beyond the laws of physics, a supernatural being who is beyond, not just, beyond the laws of physics, beyond time, beyond human understanding, is so transcendental that they can handle all the paradoxes that are involved with the existence of the universe, right? Only thing that makes sense is God. It's the only thing that makes sense. Nothing else makes sense at all. I remember, so in one of my previous videos, I talked about how Alex O'Connor, he said how if something isn't predetermined, it's random, which is not true. But that was the random conditions he imposed onto reality, which is what atheists always do. And so it's like, okay, if the universe existed and it wasn't God who was conscious, who's aware, then it would have to be random, right? That would have to be the first cause since there was nothing before it, right? That's his conditions. So, and this is what atheists believe, actually. They'll always try to shy away from this because they know it doesn't make any sense. But their argument is basically the universe just popped up out of nowhere for no reason, right? Somehow it gave itself energy. For some reason, it started organizing itself. And when you tell them that, they'll say, oh, no. We don't know why. We just don't know the laws of physics. There's still more to discuss. It's always the same excuse, right? So that's always their favorite excuse to kind of bail them out of their nonsensical beliefs, right? Is one day science will figure it out. So I talked about in other videos, the big three favorite atheist excuses are, one day science will figure it out. When you have an experience, it's you imagined it, you were delusional, it was in your head, you were on drugs, or you're lying, right? That's always the other one. And then it was just a big convenient coincidence, right? That's their big three favorite excuses. So that when they get for the beginning of the universe, they use the excuse of maybe science will one day figure it out, but they will also allude to the fact that maybe they'll never be able to figure it out. And notice what, in this, like Alex O'Connor's case, notice what he did, because I put it in the previous video, one of my previous videos. He said how, like when he was talking about free will versus determinism, he mentioned how he doesn't even have to appeal to the idea of materialism. He was like, even if we're talking about the soul, the conditions should still apply, right? If something isn't causing the soul to make a decision, then it's random. Right? If something is causing the soul to make a decision, then it's determined. Okay, I could apply that, but should not we apply that same logic to the beginning of the universe then? Right? If something didn't cause the universe to do what it did, it's random, right? And if something did, then that wouldn't be the first cause. What caused that cause to cause the universe to come into existence? So we could play this game all day till we get to the first cause by his own logic. Right? It would have to be completely random and for no reason, right? But what atheists will say, no. It could be something else we haven't conceived of yet. You mean like something supernatural, right? You mean like God? No, but except for God. It can't be that though, right? Nonsense, right? So their logic is full of contradictions. But like I said, you get like 99% of the way just by the fact that we exist. Obviously, God is the most logical answer, right? Now, so what are other forms of evidence of God? Spiritual experiences. People have them all the time across the planet, whether it be children. There are people who have pre-birth memories. Like they're in the spirit. They have memories of themselves being in the spirit before being born. It's not common, but it happens enough times that it's not like some people planned it, and it's unlikely that something like that happened. You have near-death experiences, which violate the laws of physics, which I'm going to talk about that in another video. That's another thing atheists don't realize. It does violate the laws of physics. They think it doesn't. I'm going to explain it. The experiences are so elaborate, so far, and I've had many spiritual experiences, so I'm not like, I know the nature of those experiences. I know that they're nothing like nothing like our experience during the day, and they're nothing like our experience dreaming. I haven't had a near-death experience, but I have many spiritual experiences with God. I've seen Jesus Christ. I've had experiences with the Holy Spirit. I wrote the book on metaphysics, so I know how all this stuff works. God gave me a vision of hell. You kids, when atheists say, "Oh, it's just a dream," it's so nonsensical. It's nothing like a dream. Reality is completely different in the spirit realm, in these different dimensions. But anyway, right? So that's what atheists say. But spiritual experiences are evidence of God because these are the things we would expect to see in a reality that God was in, right? So if their claim is correct and there might not be a God, right? There are things we wouldn't expect to see. We would just see the physical realm. There's really no intelligence behind anything. Or if there was, I don't see why. If an atheist is willing to accept that there might be an intelligent spirit realm, I don't see how that wouldn't just go back to God eventually, right? It doesn't make any sense. So usually they believe there's no intelligence to matter. Usually they're materialists. They don't believe in the spirit realm. And if their beliefs are true, then we shouldn't see things that violate what are the known physical laws in the modern age. Yet we see it all the time. First of all, consciousness violates the known physical laws. You can't explain it. They just ignore that, right? And again, I'll go in another video talking about those things, because I know they'll say, oh, no, neurons in the brain. That's how you explain it, which that doesn't explain it. They just ignore the first cause problem of how conscious. They always ignore the part they can't explain and then say, look, I can explain it. No, you can't. You just ignored the part you couldn't explain. And they think they ignore it and then take credit for explaining it. You know, but this is how atheist logic is what they always do. But anyway, so spiritual experiences, these spiritual experiences occur in a way that can't possibly be explained by materialism or by it just being dreams or imagination, right? You can't explain it by that, and that's exactly what we expect to see in a universe that has God. There are similarities between them. They'll say, oh, no, like this person saw Muhammad, this person saw Vishnu. That must mean there's no God. No, it doesn't. You just put you confine God to some random set of rules like atheists always do. God works in whatever way they make up in their head, and then they say God doesn't exist because he didn't work in the way they just made up in their head. No, the proper way to know the truth of God is to investigate these experiences and then try to come up with a theory that explains what's really going on, which I claim to have done, right? So that's in my course. That's why I can say this, right? The proper way is to develop a theory, investigate what's going on, and then see if you can demonstrate that all these experiences that appear different actually aren't and are following the same basic rule, right? And that's done in science all the time, right? When there are phenomena that appear different, but then you realize they're really not. That's kind of the whole point of science in the theory of everything, right? So try to make everything that happens in reality seem like one beautiful equation, right? And so anyway, like I was saying, everything we expect to see with God in it, we see. Right now, even outside of spiritual experiences, we see miracles performed, miracle healings, things that are statistically as possible. There are experiences that people have near death. Robert Marshall is one of the most amazing. He made a book called 44 Hours in Heaven, right, where he had a miraculous healing. And there are many ones like this, right, where a person will be near death, they get healed, or even if they're not near death, they get healed randomly. Some person will say it was God, where they had a spiritual experience with God and then they're healed. Doctors cannot figure out what happened. Other cases, doctors will confirm that, the person who was near death and they say they had a near-death experience, they'll confirm what was going on in the hospital. Things like that. Now, how do atheists explain those miracles? Of course, they're going to make up some excuse like they always do. They're going to say, oh, no, it could have been anything. The doctors maybe just didn't know what they were talking about, right? And they're going to say it should happen under controlled conditions, right? It should happen in an experiment, and I should be able to set things up and set up controls and things like that. Once again, opposing conditions are how reality works. So if God gives people a near-death experience, or angels or higher beings, and they see you setting up a theory, let's say they have a reason why they're ostensibly hidden, which they're really not. Once you know how the spirit realm works, once you know how to communicate them, they're absolutely, their presence is so obvious. I don't even know how people miss it. But anyway, once you know how this stuff works, if their presence seems hidden to people, is it possible that they would not want to engage in your experiment in a way that makes their presence obvious? If they were unwilling to do that, then why did they do, or if they were willing to just still give people normal near-death experiences and interactions and things like that in your experiment and allow themselves to be exposed so easily, then why didn't they do it before your experiment? Why don't they just do it all the time? Like, this is atheist logic. It's always like, it's like when someone, no, I was gonna say something, but I won't even get into that, right? But this is what I deal with atheists, right? It's always these like kind of silly, nonsensical kind of like imposed rules on God, imposed rules on reality, and imposed rules on how things must work, right? And like I always say, what they're really doing is atheists always they always conflate absence of evidence with preference of evidence. They always test God or test the supernatural according to how they would prefer it show up, not according to how it actually works, right? A true scientist investigates reality and studies it according to how it actually works. This is true. This is proper science. They always investigate it according to whatever preferences they just make up in their head, right? So of course, if this is an intelligent being, of course you would have to study the phenomenon as if this intelligence has preferences, right? If you were to, like, let's say you put me in like a cage, almost like a mouse cage or something, right? Or a mouse trap, and or some type of like, you put me in some type of, I don't want to say obstacle course, but something to test me, right? Kind of like what they do with mice, right? You want to test, you put certain reinforcers in the experiment, and you want to test my behavior, right? You want to see if I do something, in response to certain conditions you set up. Now, could you just say, let's say you put food there, and you want to see how long it takes, let's say it's some food I don't like, and you want to see how long it takes me to just eat it, before, how long I allow myself to get hungry before I just eat it, right? Let's just say, some random experiment, I'm in a cage, and, someone's setting up an experiment like that, right? Wouldn't you need to acknowledge my preferences to set up an experiment like that? Wouldn't you have to, make some appeal to what I like, the foods I like? Could you just pick any food? Because you pick the food you like, put it there, and then get proper results. Let's say you put like a cheeseburger, and I love cheeseburgers, right? Let's say you did that, and I just eat it right away, right? Because there's no reason not to. At least if I ate them, right? Let's say that there was no reason not to, right? And you say, oh man, he ate that very quickly. Therefore, Chuck will always eat food very, very quickly, even if he's not hungry, right? Or even if he's even if he's not hungry, right? Whatever the goal of the experiment, the test of the experiment is. I'm just making this up, right? But in other words, the data you collected says I will eat food very, very, very quickly, and it doesn't really matter how hungry I am. Well, that's not true, right? If you put something I don't like, let's say you put like coleslaw or something, right? It takes me a long time to eat that. I really don't like that. You know what I mean? So in the process of setting up that experiment, obviously you're going to have to include my preferences, right? If you want to know my behavior. If God exists and he's intelligent and he has preferences, wouldn't you have to acknowledge those preferences when analyzing his nature? And of course, to an atheist, they wouldn't even say yes. They would usually ignore the question. They'll make up some excuse to ignore the question. Usually they'll say, oh, you're just saying that because, there's clearly no evidence of God, or some nonsense, right? But anyway, I kind of went off at a tangent. And I could talk about this all day because I can't put it all in this video. In my course, I go through these things in much more detail about why atheism makes no sense. But my point is of course, spiritual experiences are evidence of God. Miraculous healings are evidence of God. The experiences people have in their life, these statistical anomalies that people experience in response to prayer, the feelings you get in spiritual experiences. Now, of course, atheists will say, oh, that's just, a random thing in your brain. That's not true. You would have to explain how emotions work in order to say whether or not the emotional components of the experience could be done without God, or is just something in your imagination. Now, I know how emotions work. I do have a theory, and I could tell you they can't be replicated. I know how to control my emotions. Like, I could pick, like in my theory, I think of emotions as frequencies. So your subconscious mind has frequencies kind of like a TV. Every emotion is a different frequency of the subconscious. I could pick any frequency I want to. I can charge it up, because your subconscious charges like a battery, and I can feel the emotion as much as I want to. I used to do that all the time. I used to just pick any random, well, not random, but I used to pick whatever emotion I want to feel more, and I would just charge it. And I would feel it as much as I want to have almost like a euphoric experience. And I'm telling you, no, you can't replicate the experiences you have with God. There's nothing you can do to replicate them, right? Like when I had experiences with the Holy Spirit, Jesus Christ, the Father, like these can't be there's nothing you can do. I've had them, right? And I have the theory that explains why, and you can demonstrate it. You can prove it to yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. But anyway, does the atheist have a theory on emotions? Of course not, right? Are they going to make claims about these experiences that are predicated on the way emotions work as if they had a theory? They will, but again, they don't. So how do you know this experience can be replicated through the brain when you don't even know how emotions work? And of course, they're just going to ignore that like they always do. They're going to come up with some excuse. And so, in other words, and I could go on and on and on, because then there's even statistical data like the Bible code. I'm going to make another video about that. Like I said before, they'll say the Bible code, the data that shows up in Bible code, they'll say, oh, that applies to any book that's large. That's not true. That's just another lie they made up, right, to make their beliefs work. In prophecies of Jesus, I could go on and on and on and on, right? But basically, there's a whole list of things that are evidence of God. And you can know God and have supernatural experiences with God if you take these series of steps. That's how any experiment works, right? If you don't believe me, like if someone says, you know what, I believe general relativity, right? I believe that during an eclipse, gravitational lensing occurs and, the apparent location of the star changes. Now, if you don't believe me, then you set up the experiment. I'll give you every step to do it. If you don't accept my personal testimony that I did it and that's what I saw, right? So God's the same way. If you don't accept someone's personal testimony of their experience with God, you say it's an imagination, whatever, then you perform the experiment, right? And the Bible has it too, but my course also has it, the exact set of steps you have to take to have supernatural experiences with God and things like that. Now, are they going to do it? Of course not. They're going to make up some excuse why they don't have to do it, why someone else should be able to do the work for them, which is just imposing another rule on reality, right? And I could go on and on, right? But my point is that when atheists say there's no evidence of God, that's not really true. There's plenty of evidence of God. It's all over the place. You can't get away from it, right? What they mean to say is that there is no evidence that they would prefer for God, right? They want God to simply come down, I guess, do a magic trick for them, do some type of performative magic trick, like throw a bolt of lightning or something, and then they'll say God exists, which even that wouldn't even be evidence of God, right? How do you know, if someone did that, how do you know that wouldn't be an alien, right? How do you know that wouldn't be a figment of your imagination? There's no way to know. That wouldn't even be evidence of God, someone who created the universe, is supernatural, is all-powerful, things like that. That wouldn't be evidence of that. That's just how you would just be convinced if you saw that. Right? Like there are many things that might convince me of certain laws of physics, but they're not really evidence of that law, right? Like, so for example, let's say someone, like, this is a belief they had back in the day, right? Galileo's time, well, ancient Greece time. They believed that if two objects fell, the heavier object or the object with more mass would fall faster than the object with lighter mass. Let's say I'm disputing you. I'm like, no, that's not true. And then you do it. You drop a boulder and a feather, and the boulder falls immediately, and the feather takes a long time. I might say, oh, that's evidence you were right. No, it's not, right? Because that's not true. That's actually not the law of physics. Buoyancy is the reason that happens. But if you go in a vacuum, they will fall at the same time. Now, notice that. I took something as evidence. What I requested as evidence in that case and then became convinced of wasn't even true. It wasn't even how reality works. That was just, someone could just do that to hoodwink me, right? So when someone throws a bolt of lightning or whatever atheists might want, that's still not evidence of God. That's just something that in other words, they just want to be convinced of God as defined in their imagination, which is what I said in the previous videos. All of atheist logic is predicated on begging the question, right? Which is a fallacy where you set up a basic proposition and then you make it look as if you made a new sort of logical inference based on that proposition, when you really didn't. You just restated the original proposition, right? Like if I say, if the sky is blue, how do I want to word it? If I said something like, the sky is blue, therefore what color is the sky? Or something like that. I'm trying to do it a slightly different way. But if I said, actually no, let me look up an example. Okay, so I actually came up with a better example because the way I talk about begging the question usually includes an actual question, which you don't actually need that to give an example of begging the question. So I wanted to look up a better example. So the one I got here, it says, love is the most important emotion since all the other emotions are inferior to it, which that's a perfect begging the question example. Now you can see that initially it looks like he's saying love is the most important emotion because X. What is X? It just says all the other emotions are inferior to it. But you didn't establish why the other emotions are inferior to it. You just basically said it just as a definition. In other words, love is the most important. If something's the most important emotion based on the premise or based on that example, if love, it seems like it's saying if for something to be the most important emotion, it has to be, all other emotions have to be inferior to it, right? It seems like that's what it's saying, right? So why are other emotions inferior to love then, if love is the most important emotion? Since it has that property that's most important, it must satisfy the condition that all other emotions are inferior to it. But notice how he never established why other emotions were inferior to it. He just said since other emotions are inferior. So that's basically just part of the same definition of it being the most important emotion, right? So in other words, in that statement, you're making a conclusion that's predicated on the definition that you have for love. And atheists always do that with God, right? Every conclusion they have about God and about evidence, what evidence looks like, all these things are predicated on their random made-up definition of God, right? The proper way to analyze God is to look at places where it seems like God interacts with us, which is spiritual experiences, the Bible, holy books, could be other people who speak to us. Like I've done that before. God has given me assignments to speak to certain people about him, about Jesus Christ, right? So it could be these experiences through experiences we have with prayer. So it seems like God shows up here. I would investigate these phenomena just like I would for any other phenomenon in reality, try to learn more about it and come up with a theory that allows me to predict it. Now, they would claim that they do that, which is not true. They do it according to the random definitions they just make up in their head. The random rules about God they make up in their head. They're not actually investigating how God functions inside of reality, right? And so they're all of atheist logic, how they analyze spiritual, supernatural experiences, all these things are all based on their random, just made up definition of what God is, right? If I were to investigate electricity according to some random made up definition I just made up in my head, right? Let's say I say electricity can only exist if it talks to me and buys me things. And you say, well, I have this, electrical current, right? I have this electronic device, current is moving through it. That's electricity. I'm like, no. Show that it talks and buys me things. Well, it doesn't do that. Well, hey, electricity doesn't exist then, right? That's basically atheist logic. So now why are they like flat earthers? Because flat earthers do something very similar, right? Flat earthers they're not as bad as atheists because they do engage with science to an actual degree. They do engage with reality to a degree, but they just practice bad science, right? They'll always deviate from how reality actually works and then go into the made-up definitions they make up in their head. So a flat earther will also tell you there is no evidence the earth is round, right? All the evidence shows that the earth is flat, right? Of course, there's plenty of evidence the earth is round. It's all over the place, right? It's not hard to figure out at all. A kid could probably figure out that the earth is round. And a kid could come up with evidence, and anyone who accepts science or practices proper science would say, yes, there's plenty of evidence that the earth is round. Now, if you give that to a flat earther, they're going to say no. The very data you're looking at that you're saying proves the earth is round, I'm saying it proves the earth is flat, right? And so this is the thing about evidence, right? And atheists always appeal to, when they say there's no evidence of God, it's important to remember that that's just an opinion. Evidence is always an opinion. Atheists for some reason always use it in this absolute way. I don't know why they do that. Well, their beliefs don't make any sense, but that's just one of the things I don't understand why they do, right? I could easily, like a flat earther could very easily say, somebody bring me evidence the earth is flat. They always say that actually. And people do, and then they come with all these made-up reasons why the evidence doesn't count, and then they'll still go back to saying there's no evidence the earth is round, all the evidence points to the fact that the earth is flat, right? So, and atheists do the same thing with God. Oh, give me evidence of God. You give them evidence. They'll come up with a whole bunch of excuses why it doesn't count, then they'll go back to saying there's no evidence of God. And so this is why atheists and flat earthers, in my opinion, are very similar. Like when I was a kid, I always put atheists in the same box that we now put flat earthers in, right? Flat earthers weren't a thing when I was a kid. But it's like I always put them in that same box though, right? Atheists were there before flat earthers were put into that box. And I have never for the life of me understood. I used to think when I was younger, I used to think everyone kind of just knew that knew that atheists were, that their beliefs just made no sense. And in my mind, I'm like, there's always crazy people out there, right? It wasn't until I was older that like in my late 20s, that I started to realize that there were more people who were atheists than I thought there were, and and people didn't look at them in the way that I did. And I was always confused by that. I'm like, but nothing they're saying makes any sense. None of their beliefs make any sense. Not one. All of them are nonsensical, and you can easily demonstrate it and show it, right? And it's always, till this day, it still confuses me. I don't get it. I don't get how people take them seriously. But I just want to make this video, I rant in my videos, but I just want to make this video to say that nothing can reach what I call the absolute evidence standard, right? Everything is accepted on some degree of faith, right? Even, at least on, that's the case when a person's trying to get truth on their own. I've had experiences with God, like when I had the experience the seal of the Holy Spirit. That's when I was born again, or baptized in the Holy Spirit. I had an inner knowing that I was going to be with God for all of eternity, right? And that I was a servant of God. That was an amazing experience, but I had just had that instant inner knowing, right? It was as clear as day. I talk about that experience in my course, but God, from the experience, I know that God can put things in your mind that you know 100% absolutely. And there's also things he put in your subconscious where you know things as well. That's a longer discussion though. But suffice it to say, there are most things you can't know absolutely by your own effort. I can't know that I'm really on planet Earth. I can't know that I'm not in some matrix, right? I can't know that the sun is really there and it's not some, government body trying to trick me, right? I can't know that, right? I have to accept on faith, some degree of faith, that the sun is there. I'm not in some, matrix or whatever, right? And the same thing's true with God. In fact, God says it's impossible to please him without faith. If it pleases God to seek him, then probably you're going to have to do it on faith. And of course, and this is in the Bible, right? So of course, atheists will completely ignore that part and just critique the Bible, saying God didn't make himself obvious, even though he said he wasn't going to do that. So, but that's how atheists think, right? It's always, they'll just pick and choose which parts they want to appeal to in terms of yielding to the definition of, and then which parts they just go to their made-up definition of God for, right? When criticizing the Bible or saying there's no evidence of God, right? But anyway, again, nothing can reach the absolute evidence standard, right? It's impossible. And you'll notice that atheist arguments, I'll probably make this in my next video, they always appeal to that standard. But in the end, everything's accepted on some degree of faith, right? Including the existence of God. Well, once you have a certain number of experiences with God, you just know. But including the existence of God, you're accepting on faith, just like you accept the universe is here and you're on planet Earth and these are real people, not just like NPCs, right? You're accepting the existence of God on faith, right? And what's, like I made in my last video, what's supposed to bring you to God is you accept he exists on faith, but you approach God through the purity of your heart by trying to be a better person. You keep seeking him from that perspective, right? That's a longer discussion, which I go over in my course. I talked about it last video, but I also go over in my course in more detail as well, right? But it's always going to be the case that anything you accept as true is always going to come down to your own personal opinion. That's it. Don't let atheists convince you when they say there's no evidence of God, that that's some type of absolute statement. It isn't, right? Two people can look at some data, no matter what it is. It could be data that says, there's such thing as laws of physics, right? Like you can have data that shows Newton's laws are correct. Two people can look at it, which is classical mechanics, and they can both come to different conclusions, right? No matter how many experiments I set up showing that Newton's laws are correct and Lagrangian mechanics are correct, I can look at it and show someone and say, look, I can perfectly predict this outcome, this outcome, and this outcome. This outcome. Someone else could still look at it and say, nope, it doesn't prove it. And they'll come up with some excuse, some reason why it doesn't, right? So at the end of the day, when we say we know something is true, like I know God exists, it's always going to come down, or I say there's evidence of God, it's always going to come down to you looking at data and then drawing your own conclusion, which is just your opinion. That's it, right? Don't let atheists convince you that that's not what's happening, right? The same way flat earthers can look at a whole bunch of data that about the earth, they would look at it and say, this data proves the earth is flat. Another person would look at it and say, this data proves the earth is round. Now, who's right? Generally, we could say the people believe the earth is round, but we can't prove it, right? There's no way to prove it. We can just give what we think is highly convincing data, and that's it. That's the best we can do. If someone's not convinced, then there's nothing else I can do, right? What someone accepts as true about reality is always going to eventually be predicated on their own, basically their own intelligence, their own beliefs, their own opinion, their own character. That's it. Doesn't matter how much evidence that God gives us, right, which he gives us a lot, there's always going to, well, it's really only atheists, but there's always a possibility that there's going to be someone who looks at that evidence and says this doesn't prove God exists. But most people can say, oh yeah, this obviously proves God exists because it's obviously the case that God exists. So basically, that's what I want to talk about in this video. Flat earthers are basically very similar to atheists in that despite all the obvious evidence the earth is round and all the obvious evidence that God exists, there will always be flat earthers who say this evidence still proves the earth is flat and not round. And there will always be atheists who say all this obvious evidence of God proves God doesn't prove God exists. Is not evidence for the existence of God. So I still don't think God exists, right? Or I still some of them don't think God exists as a positive statement. Others just say I don't know, which is not really true, right? A lot of them just believe there is no God because they don't believe there's evidence of God, right? But anyway, so that's what I'm talking about in this video. They're basically very similar. Again, if you're more interested in learning information in my course, then you can look up links in the description. It's a free, roughly 2-semester course. I talk about the mechanics of the spirit realm, and you can have experiences with God, with Jesus Christ, with the Holy Spirit, and I talk about the whole rules of that whole system. Once you know the mechanics of the spirit realm and you have that relationship with God, because he shows you a whole bunch, he starts showing you things. He starts showing you things about the spirit realm, how it works. You start having different experiences. It's amazing, but it's so easy. It still shocks me to this day that people think there's no spirit realm. With all the activity that goes on in the spirit realm, it's not quiet. There's so much that goes on in the spirit realm. And it's always eventually going to come into our lives or interact with us in some way, right? In our dreams, in our daydreams, in feelings that we have, in compulsions we feel. There's always going to be, you can't get away from the spirit realm. It's amazing to me that people will have these experiences, and they do have experiences with the spirit realm. Sometimes they have demonic dreams, things like that, and they just ignore it. They convince themselves it's not real. It's amazing to me. There's so much activity in the spirit realm. It's it's hard. It's to me, the spirit realm is I have to be aware of what's going on in the spirit realm, not as much as the physical realm, but in a way, as a responsible adult, right? I got to know what's going on in the spirit realm around me so that I can function properly. It would be crazy for me to just not know what's happening spiritually around me or not engage with the spirit realm. That to me, that's almost it's like what I see, when you see if you were to see a kid playing around in dirt and mud and they got an open cut or something and it's possible for them to get infected. No, you gotta behave in a way. And then, kids are different, but you gotta behave in a way where you behave responsibly out of recognition of the microscopic world, right? It can hurt you. You know what I mean? Spirit realm's the same way. You have a responsibility to know what's going on in the spirit realm, but most people just ignore it. It's crazy to me. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.